It was supposed to be just another routine flight, the kind that blends into the background of countless others. But for Dr. Marcus Thomas, a well-respected black doctor, this flight would become a moment he would never forget, and neither would anyone who witnessed what happened next. What started as a brief exchange on an airplane escalated in a way that no one could have predicted, leaving the passengers in stunned silence. Dr. Thomas had been traveling back from a medical conference, tired but content after a successful weekend of discussions and networking. He settled into his seat, ready for a peaceful flight home. Little did he know, the man sitting just a few rows away would soon target him with an insult so blatant, it would spark a confrontation that would leave the entire cabin speechless. The man, a middle-aged CEO from a successful tech company, had been sitting quietly, scrolling through his phone. At first, there seemed to be no tension. But as the flight went on, his gaze began to linger on Dr. Thomas. The kind of lingering that made it clear he was sizing him up. Then, as the plane started its descent, the CEO made an offhand comment that immediately put Dr. Thomas on alert. It was a comment that was supposed to be casual, but it had a venomous edge to it. It started with a question about Dr. Thomas's job. And before Dr. Thomas could respond, the CEO sneered, making a pointed remark about how a doctor like you must be used to playing second fiddle to the real professionals. The words were wrapped in a smirk, but the intent was clear. It was an insult designed to belittle, to dismiss. The plane grew suddenly quiet as other passengers noticed the exchange. But what happened next would silence the entire cabin, as Dr. Thomas did something that no one saw coming. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't react in anger. Instead, he calmly responded, forcing the CEO to question everything he thought he knew. His words were sharp, but measured. With every syllable, the atmosphere shifted. The CEO, who had once been so confident, now found himself trapped by his own words, unable to escape the truth of what Dr. Thomas said. As the conversation unfolded, it became clear that the story was not just about one man's attempt to degrade another. It was about power, perception, and the untold stories that we carry within us. The moment on that plane turned into something far larger than a simple confrontation. It was a lesson for everyone who heard it. And what Dr. Thomas did next? It left the entire cabin, and the CEO, speechless. But that wasn't the end of the story. What followed was even more surprising, as the CEO faced an unexpected reckoning. This wasn't just a flight anymore, it was a reminder of the power of standing your ground, no matter who tries to tear you down. So what exactly did Dr. Thomas say to shut the CEO down? How did the passengers react to this unexpected showdown? And most importantly, what happened next? Stay tuned, because the conclusion of this story will leave you thinking long after the credits roll. The tension in the cabin was palpable. Dr. Marcus Thomas sat there, his fingers gripping the armrest of his seat, trying to remain calm. He had spent years in some of the most stressful and high-pressure situations in the operating room, but nothing had prepared him for this. A man who had never seen him before, a man who seemed to believe his success gave him the right to speak down to others, had just tried to belittle him in front of a plane full of people. The fact that it came from someone like him, the CEO of a major tech company, made the insult even harder to swallow. Dr. Thomas wasn't just a doctor, he was a highly respected one. His career had been built on years of hard work, sacrifice, and a dedication to making a difference. He had saved lives, trained medical students, and had even been invited to speak at conferences around the world. But to this CEO, that meant nothing. To him, Dr. Thomas wasn't a professional. He was just another minority, as he'd subtly implied with his dismissive tone. And that was what struck Dr. Thomas the hardest, the casual way in which the CEO thought he could reduce him to nothing more than his race, instead of recognizing the hard work and intellect that had gotten him where he was. It was the kind of microaggression that Dr. Thomas had encountered too many times in his life. The kind of moment where someone in a position of privilege assumes their power gives them the right to dismiss someone else's humanity. It wasn't the first time he'd been confronted with ignorance like this, but it was the first time he felt so compelled to respond. He wasn't going to let this man, this complete stranger, get away with it. The CEO, sitting a few rows ahead, didn't seem to realize how much he had already overstepped. He continued to stare at his phone, likely oblivious to the growing unease among the other passengers. A few had glanced over, sensing something was wrong, but no one said a word. It was as if everyone was waiting for someone else to speak up. And that's when Dr. Thomas finally found his voice. He wasn't about to let this moment pass without saying something, especially when he knew that a lot of people, especially young people of color, would look at this situation and wonder whether it was worth standing up to someone in power. He wasn't just fighting for himself, but for anyone who had ever been belittled, ignored, or discriminated against simply because of who they were. The flight attendants continued to serve drinks and snacks, their steps soft and measured, as if unaware of the tension building in the back of the plane. Dr. Thomas knew he had to act fast. The longer he stayed silent, the more he'd feel the weight of his own inaction. Taking a deep breath, he turned toward the CEO, his voice calm but firm. "Excuse me," Dr. Thomas began, his words deliberate. "I'm not sure what you meant by that comment, but I think you may have made a mistake." The CEO, still absorbed in his phone, didn't immediately acknowledge Dr. Thomas. He let out an exaggerated sigh, clearly annoyed at being interrupted. But when he finally looked up and saw the intensity in Dr. Thomas's eyes, he froze. "What mistake?" the CEO asked, his tone dripping with condescension. He clearly didn't understand why Dr. Thomas was challenging him, and it only fueled the fire that was beginning to burn inside Dr. Thomas. "I'm not the one you think I am," Dr. Thomas replied, his voice steady. "I'm not just a doctor, in the sense you're implying. I've spent my entire life earning the title, and I've worked in some of the most demanding and high-stakes situations imaginable." The passengers around them began to shift in their seats, sensing that this wasn't just a typical disagreement. The CEO, still not fully grasping the gravity of what was happening, let out a short laugh. "Well, I'm sure that's all well and good, but I just don't see how someone in your position can really compare to the kind of professionals I work with. You know, the ones that are making real changes in the world." It was a comment that could have easily been brushed off by someone else. But for Dr. Thomas, it was the tipping point. He knew he couldn't let it slide. His heart raced, but he knew that in this moment, he had to keep his composure. "No," he said quietly, his eyes narrowing, "you're right. I'm not one of your real professionals. I'm someone who's spent years in the trenches, facing the realities of life and death every single day. I've worked with people from every walk of life, people who don't have the privilege of your kind of success. But I guarantee you this, my work, and the work of people like me, has a much more immediate and tangible impact than anything your company or your position will ever do." For a moment, the plane was completely silent. The hum of the engines, the sound of the flight attendant's footsteps, all of it seemed to fade into the background. Everyone was listening, and the CEO, for the first time, seemed to realize the depth of the conversation he had just unwittingly walked into. His face reddened, and for a brief moment, he looked uncertain, his usual confidence shattered. "Look, I didn't mean to offend you," he stammered, clearly trying to backpedal. "I just thought you were some kind of flight doctor or something, you know, just doing your job for a few hours." Dr. Thomas didn't flinch. "I've spent my entire career earning the respect of my peers. You may think I'm just a doctor, but I'm far from it. I've spent countless hours studying, practicing, and pushing myself to the limit. And if you think the kind of work I do is less significant than whatever it is you do, then you need to reassess your entire perspective on what real value is." The tension in the air was suffocating. Passengers were now openly watching the interaction, some of them holding their breath. A few glanced nervously at one another, unsure of how to react. The flight attendants paused, exchanging silent glances, as if they too were waiting for something to break the silence. The CEO looked like he was about to speak again, but his words caught in his throat. His confident demeanor had crumbled, replaced by the growing realization that he had severely misjudged this situation. It was no longer about him being the powerful figure in the room. It was about Dr. Thomas challenging his entire worldview. But just as the CEO opened his mouth to say something, the plane hit a sudden patch of turbulence. The jolt of the aircraft caused everyone to grip their armrests, momentarily distracting them from the heated exchange. It was like the universe was giving the CEO a moment to collect himself, an opportunity to either back out gracefully or dig himself even deeper. Dr. Thomas's eyes never left the CEO's face. He wasn't going to let him off the hook that easily. What would the CEO do next? Would he continue to deny his mistake, or would he finally come to terms with the fact that sometimes, power isn't enough to silence the truth? The silence hung heavy between them as the turbulence subsided, and the crowd was left on edge, wondering what would come next. The turbulence passed, but the uneasy feeling in the cabin lingered, like a storm cloud hanging in the air. Dr. Thomas could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him. His hands were still slightly trembling from the adrenaline, but he wasn't going to let that show. He kept his gaze fixed on the CEO, who had shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his once confident posture now slouched and defensive. The moment of confrontation had passed, but it was clear that something had shifted, not just between the two men, but in the minds of everyone who had witnessed the exchange. As the plane returned to its steady course, Dr. Thomas couldn't help but feel a sense of satisfaction. He had stood up for himself in a way that was measured, controlled, and undeniable. But there was something else at play here. This wasn't just about him putting the CEO in his place. It was about something much bigger. It was about every single person who had been dismissed, overlooked, or underestimated because of their race, their background, or their profession. He had said it aloud, and now the truth was out there, echoing in the quiet cabin. Still, Dr. Thomas knew this wasn't the end. It couldn't be. People like the CEO didn't change their minds just because they were called out. They had too much pride, too much power wrapped up in their belief that they were untouchable. Dr. Thomas had been in situations like this before, where his very presence was questioned simply because of the color of his skin or the perceived value of his profession. But he had never been in a situation where the challenge was so public, so inescapable. The eyes of the passengers were all on the CEO now, waiting to see how he would respond. The CEO didn't speak. Instead, he fidgeted with the hem of his jacket, his fingers moving nervously. Dr. Thomas knew that silence often spoke louder than words. But what was the CEO thinking now? Was he reflecting on his words? Was he trying to figure out a way to salvage his reputation? Or was he just hoping this would blow over so he could go back to his comfort zone, free from the consequences of his actions? Across the aisle, a young woman sat, her eyes wide, watching the interaction between the two men. She had heard the exchange, and now, she was reflecting on her own experiences. As a black woman in a predominantly white industry, she had been subject to similar dismissals, to people assuming her competence based on her race, not her qualifications. She had always stayed quiet, letting the small comments slide, believing it wasn't worth the confrontation. But now, seeing Dr. Thomas stand his ground, something stirred within her. Maybe it was time to stop letting people off the hook. Maybe it was time to start demanding respect, the way Dr. Thomas had. But it wasn't just the young woman who had been affected. Further down the aisle, an older man, a retired engineer, had been listening intently. His eyes, though wrinkled with age, were sharp with understanding. He had seen the world change over the decades, but there were still moments, like this one, that reminded him how far people still had to go. He had dealt with his own share of biases in his career, especially in a time when diversity wasn't as openly embraced as it was today. But the comment the CEO had made struck him deep. It wasn't just the words, it was the way the CEO had assumed his power over another person. He had thought he was better, superior in some way. And that attitude, the retired engineer knew, was something that needed to be challenged at every turn. But not everyone on the plane shared the same perspective. There was a man sitting in the row directly in front of Dr. Thomas, who had remained eerily quiet throughout the entire exchange. He had overheard the insult and heard Dr. Thomas's calm response, but he wasn't sure where he stood. The man had grown up in a different world, one where these kinds of tensions, racial, social, were often ignored, brushed under the rug. His life had been one of privilege, and while he didn't condone racism or prejudice, he often felt out of place when things got too uncomfortable. He didn't know what to say. He didn't know if this was the right moment to intervene or speak up. But there was a part of him, deep down, that was uneasy. The way the CEO had tried to belittle Dr. Thomas struck him as wrong, but he was struggling to reconcile that with his own discomfort at the confrontation. It was easier to pretend these things didn't happen, to avoid the conflict. But as he watched the CEO, still silent and fuming, he realized that this wasn't something that could be ignored anymore. His discomfort was a sign. Perhaps it was time for him to start questioning the systems of power and privilege he had benefited from all his life. Meanwhile, Dr. Thomas was fighting an internal battle of his own. He knew that standing up to the CEO wasn't going to change everything. It wasn't going to magically make the world a better place. But what he did know was that he had sent a message. And while the CEO might have had the upper hand in terms of status and wealth, Dr. Thomas had something that the CEO could never take away: his integrity. He had spoken the truth, and now, it hung in the air like a question. Could the CEO walk away from this encounter unchanged? Could he simply dismiss what had happened, or would this moment be the one that forced him to look deeper into his own beliefs? The plane continued its course, the cabin filled with a low hum, as if everyone was collectively holding their breath. The flight attendants had gone silent, sensing the shift in the atmosphere. One of them, a young woman with short brown hair, exchanged a brief glance with her colleague, a man who had been working the aisle. Neither of them had spoken during the confrontation, but they were both aware of what had just occurred. They were both aware of how uncomfortable things had become. The young flight attendant had seen her fair share of passengers with inflated egos, the kind who thought their position in life gave them the right to treat others as less than. But this was different. This wasn't just another arrogant business traveler. This was someone who had crossed a line. The young attendant couldn't help but think about the impact of Dr. Thomas's words. If more people started speaking up like he had, if more people called out the casual racism, the dismissive behavior, maybe things would start to change. But would they? Would this be the moment that started a ripple effect? Or would it fade away just like all the other uncomfortable situations people chose to ignore? As the plane's descent began, the tension in the cabin remained. No one had moved. No one had said anything. The CEO still hadn't responded to Dr. Thomas's words, his expression darkening with each passing second. It was clear that whatever happened next, this flight would be remembered, not for the destination, but for the moment when two people's lives collided in a way that would leave everyone questioning what was truly worth fighting for. The story was far from over. As the plane began its final descent, the tension seemed to grow thicker with every passing minute. Dr. Thomas remained calm, though inside, his mind was racing. He had expected the confrontation to shake things up, but not like this. He had expected the CEO to either apologize or try to brush it off, but instead, the man had gone silent. The longer the silence stretched, the more it felt like a time bomb ticking away, each second building toward an inevitable moment. And yet, the CEO refused to speak, his eyes glued to his phone, as if trying to convince himself that this awkwardness would just evaporate. The young woman who had been watching the exchange earlier still sat, frozen in her seat, her hands gripping the armrests. She couldn't look away, her heart pounding in her chest. She had never seen anything like this before, and a part of her wanted to jump in, to say something, to back Dr. Thomas up. But she was unsure of what to say, unsure if it would even make a difference. Still, the way the CEO had refused to acknowledge his mistake gnawed at her. The man had power, and in the back of her mind, she kept asking herself if that power was going to protect him from the consequences of his actions. Nearby, the older retired engineer shifted in his seat, his hands folded on his lap, eyes locked on the scene unfolding before him. He wasn't one to jump into conflict, but this was different. This was about something more than just one arrogant CEO and one well-spoken doctor. This was about standing up for what was right, about calling out the unfairness that people often let slide because it was easier to turn a blind eye. The retired engineer knew that if nobody said anything, the status quo would continue. And if it continued, people like the CEO would keep believing they were untouchable. But it wasn't just the passengers who were feeling the weight of the situation. The flight attendants, normally calm and composed, were clearly unsettled. The young woman who had exchanged glances with her colleague earlier was now actively avoiding looking toward the CEO, her eyes darting nervously as if afraid of drawing attention to herself. She could feel the shift in the air, the unease, the uncertainty. She had seen passengers like the CEO before, people who believed their wealth or their position could shield them from accountability. But this time, the tables had turned. This time, the power dynamic wasn't what he expected. And then, as the plane continued its descent, Dr. Thomas felt a strange shift in the atmosphere. It wasn't just the passengers who were holding their breath anymore. It was as if the whole plane, the whole world, was waiting for the next move. Would the CEO finally break the silence? Would he attempt to apologize, or would he lash out in anger, doubling down on his previous remarks? Dr. Thomas knew that whatever happened next would determine whether the CEO would ever walk away from this moment with the same arrogance he had entered the plane with. But what would it cost to hold someone like him accountable? Dr. Thomas wasn't sure, But the thought of letting the moment pass without a response made him feel like he was betraying something more than just himself. The CEO's fingers twitched on the screen of his phone, but he still didn't speak. His face, once flushed with irritation, now looked more like a mask, something cold and calculating behind the surface. He wasn't stupid. He knew that he had been put in an uncomfortable position. He knew that there were eyes on him now, and for the first time, he could feel the weight of it. What had started as an attempt to assert his superiority had turned into a moment of reckoning. But he wasn't ready to back down, not yet. His mind raced, his thoughts spinning as he considered his next move. Dr. Thomas had seen this before. The way people like the CEO, when confronted with the consequences of their actions, would often retreat into defensiveness, feigning ignorance, or pretending they hadn't done anything wrong. He had faced countless patients, colleagues, and even friends who had done the same, pretended they didn't understand the hurt they caused, denied the impact of their words, and tried to make the world bend to their will. But Dr. Thomas wasn't going to let that happen today. He couldn't. Not when this moment had the potential to be something bigger. He leaned forward slightly, his voice low, but enough for the CEO to hear. "You've had your chance to dismiss me, to belittle me. But this isn't just about me anymore. This is about everyone who's ever been made to feel small because of their race, their career, their background. This is about people who've been told they don't matter, who've been told they'll never be good enough, no matter how hard they work." The CEO shifted uncomfortably in his seat. He opened his mouth, as though to say something, but the words didn't come. Dr. Thomas could see the man's jaw tightening, his eyes flicking around the cabin as if searching for an escape. But there was no escape. Not from this. Not now. "Do you want to know what real power is?" Dr. Thomas continued, his voice growing more resolute. "It's not having a title. It's not having money. It's the ability to recognize the humanity in others and treat them with respect, no matter who they are. That's the real power. And if you can't see that, if you can't see me for who I really am, then you're the one who's truly lost." The words hung in the air like a challenge. The CEO's face turned a shade paler, but still, he didn't respond. The other passengers were now fully invested in the outcome of this silent standoff, their eyes darting between the two men. No one moved, no one dared to breathe too loudly. And then, just as the plane was about to touch down, the CEO's hand slammed down onto the armrest, his eyes flashing with anger. His lips twisted into a sneer as he shot Dr. Thomas a look that could only be described as cold, calculating, and full of contempt. The silence broke, but what followed was not an apology, not an admission of guilt. Instead, the CEO opened his mouth to speak, and the words that came out were anything but what anyone expected. "Who do you think you are, talking to me like that?" The words were sharp, venomous. He had taken the bait, but not in the way anyone had anticipated. His voice, once smooth and confident, now cracked with frustration. The tension in the cabin escalated, and Dr. Thomas could feel the room collectively holding its breath. This wasn't over yet. The battle had only just begun. The CEO's words hung in the air like a challenge, but they weren't met with fear or hesitation. Dr. Thomas had expected some sort of reaction, but this was different. The CEO's tone was bitter, dripping with a kind of arrogance that was hard to ignore. For a brief moment, there was a flicker of doubt in Dr. Thomas's mind. Had he pushed too far? Had he made a mistake by confronting someone so powerful, someone who could easily destroy his career with a simple phone call or a few well-placed words? But that doubt vanished as quickly as it appeared. He wasn't here to back down. The cabin grew deathly quiet again. Passengers who had been glued to their seats, trying not to make eye contact, now found themselves caught in a web of suspense. The older engineer, who had been watching all along, shifted in his seat again, his eyes narrowing as if sensing something more was coming. The young woman's grip on her armrest tightened. This wasn't just about racism anymore. This was about power, pride, and something far more dangerous than a simple misunderstanding. The CEO's anger wasn't just about Dr. Thomas, it was about losing control. Power had always been something he wielded like a weapon. And in this moment, in front of a plane full of witnesses, he was at his breaking point. His words were designed to provoke, to reassert his dominance, but they had the opposite effect. Dr. Thomas wasn't the type of man to cower under pressure. Instead, he stood his ground, leaning in slightly and locking eyes with the CEO. "You may think your money and your status give you the right to treat people any way you want," Dr. Thomas said, his voice cold and unwavering. But they don't. And if you think you can scare me into silence, you've got another thing coming. The words seemed to shock the CEO, but it wasn't just the force of Dr. Thomas's response that rattled him. There was something else in the air now, a sense of inevitability, as if something far bigger than both of them was about to unfold. And just when it seemed like the CEO might retort again, something unexpected happened. From the back of the plane, a woman stood up, her face flushed with anger. She was mid-40s, dressed in professional attire, her expression one of quiet rage. She stepped forward, not toward the CEO, but toward Dr. Thomas. The tension in the air thickened as everyone turned to look at her, unsure of what she would do. Was she going to side with the CEO? Or was she about to back Dr. Thomas up? The woman made her way down the aisle, her eyes locked on Dr. Thomas. As she approached, there was a split second when it seemed like she might say something to defuse the situation. But instead, she placed a hand on the back of his seat and leaned down, speaking in a voice low enough for only Dr. Thomas to hear. "You have no idea who you're dealing with," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "The CEO may have crossed a line, but you just stepped into something much bigger than you think." Dr. Thomas blinked, taken aback by the cryptic warning. Who was this woman? Why did she seem so sure of what was about to happen? His mind raced. Was she some kind of ally? Or was she trying to warn him off? Her words hit him like a punch to the gut. He had known that the CEO was dangerous, but now, it seemed like there were forces at play that he hadn't anticipated. Before he could ask her what she meant, the woman straightened up and turned to face the CEO. She didn't say a word, but her gaze, sharp and direct, was enough to send a chill down his spine. The CEO recoiled slightly, his earlier bravado faltering for just a moment. For the first time since this confrontation had started, he seemed unsure of himself. But then, the woman turned back to Dr. Thomas, her eyes darkening as she spoke again, though this time, her voice was louder, more urgent. "Whatever you think is happening here," she warned, "it's not what it seems. You've set something in motion that neither of you can control. It's too late now." The plane, which had been filled with an almost suffocating tension, now seemed to freeze. Passengers exchanged confused glances, unsure if they had just overheard a cryptic threat or an ominous warning. The flight attendants stood at the back, exchanging looks of their own. One of them, a man in his late 30s, quietly whispered to his colleague, "What the hell was that about?" The CEO, now visibly rattled, stood abruptly, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. His face, once a mask of confidence, was now pale, his eyes darting around the cabin. His mouth opened as though to speak, but the words wouldn't come. And then, just when it seemed like the moment might collapse into more uncertainty, the woman turned to Dr. Thomas one last time, her expression unreadable. "Don't trust anyone," she said, her voice carrying an edge of finality. "Not even me." And with that, she sat back down in her seat, leaving Dr. Thomas standing there, feeling like a pawn in a much larger game. He wanted to process what had just happened, to understand the implications of her words, but the flight attendants were now moving briskly down the aisle, preparing for the plane's landing. The cabin was alive with activity again, but it felt different, more charged. The CEO, still visibly shaken, sank back into his seat, his face flushed with a mix of anger and confusion. For the first time, it was clear that his sense of control was slipping. And as the plane continued its descent, it became apparent that this wasn't just a moment of personal reckoning for him. Something much larger was in motion, something that Dr. Thomas was now a part of, whether he liked it or not. The woman's words replayed in Dr. Thomas's mind. He had no idea what he had stepped into, but one thing was certain. The conflict he had started wasn't over. Not by a long shot. And the stakes had just gotten much higher than he ever could have imagined. The CEO's words hung in the air like a challenge, but they weren't met with fear or hesitation. Dr. Thomas had expected some sort of reaction, but this was different. The CEO's tone was bitter, dripping with a kind of arrogance that was hard to ignore. For a brief moment, there was a flicker of doubt in Dr. Thomas's mind. Had he pushed too far? Had he made a mistake by confronting someone so powerful, someone who could easily destroy his career with a simple phone call or a few well-placed words? But that doubt vanished as quickly as it appeared. He wasn't here to back down. The cabin grew deathly quiet again. Passengers who had been glued to their seats, trying not to make eye contact, now found themselves caught in a web of suspense. The older engineer, who had been watching all along, shifted in his seat again, his eyes narrowing as if sensing something more was coming. The young woman's grip on her armrest tightened. This wasn't just about racism anymore. This was about power, pride, and something far more dangerous than a simple misunderstanding. The CEO's anger wasn't just about Dr. Thomas, it was about losing control. Power had always been something he wielded like a weapon. And in this moment, in front of a plane full of witnesses, he was at his breaking point. His words were designed to provoke, to reassert his dominance, but they had the opposite effect. Dr. Thomas wasn't the type of man to cower under pressure. Instead, he stood his ground, leaning in slightly and locking eyes with the CEO. "You may think your money and your status give you the right to treat people any way you want," Dr. Thomas said, his voice cold and unwavering. "But they don't. And if you think you can scare me into silence, you've got another thing coming." The words seemed to shock the CEO, but it wasn't just the force of Dr. Thomas's response that rattled him. There was something else in the air now, a sense of inevitability, as if something far bigger than both of them was about to unfold. And just when it seemed like the CEO might retort again, something unexpected happened. From the back of the plane, a woman stood up, her face flushed with anger. She was mid-40s, dressed in professional attire, her expression one of quiet rage. She stepped forward, not toward the CEO, but toward Dr. Thomas. The tension in the air thickened as everyone turned to look at her, unsure of what she would do. Was she going to side with the CEO? Or was she about to back Dr. Thomas up? The woman made her way down the aisle, her eyes locked on Dr. Thomas. As she approached, there was a split second when it seemed like she might say something to defuse the situation. But instead, she placed a hand on the back of his seat and leaned down, speaking in a voice low enough for only Dr. Thomas to hear. "You have no idea who you're dealing with," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "The CEO may have crossed a line, but you just stepped into something much bigger than you think." Dr. Thomas blinked, taken aback by the cryptic warning. Who was this woman? Why did she seem so sure of what was about to happen? His mind raced. Was she some kind of ally? Or was she trying to warn him off? Her words hit him like a punch to the gut. He had known that the CEO was dangerous, but now, it seemed like there were forces at play that he hadn't anticipated. Before he could ask her what she meant, the woman straightened up and turned to face the CEO. She didn't say a word, but her gaze, sharp and direct, was enough to send a chill down his spine. The CEO recoiled slightly, his earlier bravado faltering for just a moment. For the first time since this confrontation had started, he seemed unsure of himself. But then, the woman turned back to Dr. Thomas, her eyes darkening as she spoke again, though this time, her voice was louder, more urgent. "Whatever you think is happening here," she warned, "it's not what it seems. You've set something in motion that neither of you can control. It's too late now." The plane, which had been filled with an almost suffocating tension, now seemed to freeze. Passengers exchanged confused glances, unsure if they had just overheard a cryptic threat or an ominous warning. The flight attendants stood at the back, exchanging looks of their own. One of them, a man in his late 30s, quietly whispered to his colleague, "What the hell was that about?" The CEO, now visibly rattled, stood abruptly, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. His face, once a mask of confidence, was now pale, his eyes darting around the cabin. His mouth opened as though to speak, but the words wouldn't come. And then, just when it seemed like the moment might collapse into more uncertainty, the woman turned to Dr. Thomas one last time, her expression unreadable. "Don't trust anyone," she said, her voice carrying an edge of finality. "Not even me." And with that, she sat back down in her seat, leaving Dr. Thomas standing there, feeling like a pawn in a much larger game. He wanted to process what had just happened, to understand the implications of her words, but the flight attendants were now moving briskly down the aisle, preparing for the plane's landing. The cabin was alive with activity again, but it felt different, more charged. The CEO, still visibly shaken, sank back into his seat, his face flushed with a mix of anger and confusion. For the first time, it was clear that his sense of control was slipping. And as the plane continued its descent, it became apparent that this wasn't just a moment of personal reckoning for him. Something much larger was in motion, something that Dr. Thomas was now a part of, whether he liked it or not. The woman's words replayed in Dr. Thomas's mind. He had no idea what he had stepped into, but one thing was certain. The conflict he had started wasn't over. Not by a long shot. And the stakes had just gotten much higher than he ever could have imagined. As the plane touched down, the entire cabin seemed to hold its breath, every passenger waiting for the moment of reckoning. Dr. Thomas's heart raced in his chest, his mind still spinning from the cryptic warning he had just received. The woman's words were like a dark cloud hanging over him, each one carrying an ominous weight he couldn't shake. But there was no more time for doubt now. The CEO, still visibly rattled, was doing everything he could to maintain his composure, but his hand, gripping the armrest, trembled ever so slightly. For the first time, it seemed like the man who had once been so sure of himself was beginning to crack. As the seatbelt sign turned off and passengers started gathering their belongings, a sense of finality hung in the air. Dr. Thomas was about to make his move. He was determined not to let this moment pass without addressing the wrong that had been done. But before he could even stand up, the unexpected happened. The CEO turned to him, his face pale, his voice almost pleading. "You have no idea what you've done," he said, his words low but sharp. The shift in his tone caught Dr. Thomas off guard. He had expected defiance, maybe another round of insults, but not this. There was a crack in the man's armor, and Dr. Thomas couldn't help but feel a flicker of satisfaction. He had pushed him to this point, and for a brief moment, he thought maybe, just maybe, he was finally going to break. But before he could respond, a voice from the back of the plane interrupted. "You're both wasting your time." The voice was unmistakable, cutting through the air like a knife. Dr. Thomas turned around to see the woman who had warned him earlier standing once again, her expression no longer one of anger but of something darker, something more dangerous. "I tried to warn you," she said, her eyes narrowing as she locked eyes with both men. "But it's already too late. The strings have been pulled, and there's nothing you can do to untangle them now." The CEO's eyes widened. "What are you talking about?" His voice was barely above a whisper, but it held a note of desperation. Dr. Thomas felt his chest tighten. Was this woman some kind of insider? Had she been playing some game all along, watching everything unfold from the sidelines? The woman stepped forward, her gaze shifting between the two men. "You're both players in a game much bigger than you realize," she continued, her voice steady. "And what happened here today? This moment? It's just the beginning. There's a network of people who've been watching this situation unfold, and they won't let it go unnoticed." Dr. Thomas felt a chill run down his spine. What was she implying? Had his confrontation with the CEO been some sort of setup, a catalyst for something much larger? Before he could ask, the woman took another step forward, her next words hitting like a ton of bricks. "You think the CEO has the power to destroy your career?" she said, turning to Dr. Thomas. "He doesn't. The real power lies elsewhere. People with connections, people who pull strings from behind the scenes. They've been watching this moment unfold, and they've already decided the outcome." The weight of her words hit Dr. Thomas like a wave crashing over him. It was a revelation that left him speechless. All the anger, all the frustration he had felt toward the CEO suddenly felt insignificant in comparison to the forces at play behind the curtain. It wasn't just about a racist CEO and a doctor standing up for himself anymore. This was about a system, a network of influence and power that had been silently shaping the narrative all along. The CEO's face was a mix of confusion and disbelief. He looked like a man who had just realized he had been a pawn all along. What do you mean?" he stammered, his eyes darting between Dr. Thomas and the woman, who now seemed to hold the keys to a much larger puzzle. The woman smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "The people you've been working with, they're not who you think they are," she said, her voice low but filled with venom. "And the moment you chose to belittle Dr. Thomas? That wasn't just a personal mistake. It was a tipping point. And it's going to cost you more than you realize." Dr. Thomas could feel his blood run cold. Was this woman some kind of whistleblower, exposing the CEO's connections? Or was she part of the very system that had allowed people like the CEO to thrive? But before anyone could say another word, the flight attendant, who had been watching everything unfold from the back of the plane, stepped forward. He had been quiet up until now, but his presence commanded immediate attention. "The plane's landing, and so is this situation," the flight attendant said, his voice firm. He locked eyes with both the woman and the CEO before turning to Dr. Thomas. "We're not done yet, but you'll need to come with me." Confusion swept through Dr. Thomas, his mind spinning as he tried to make sense of what was happening. The flight attendant wasn't just part of the crew. He was in on this, whatever this was. And the woman, she wasn't just some random passenger. She was connected, too. He had no idea who or what to trust anymore. Before Dr. Thomas could respond, the woman's eyes flicked to the window, her face now hard and resolute. "You have no idea how deep this goes," she said, almost as if she were speaking to herself. "But you will. Soon enough." In that moment, everything clicked into place. This wasn't just about a racist encounter on a plane. This was about a power struggle that reached far beyond the confines of the aircraft. The CEO, the woman, even the flight attendant, they were all part of something much larger, a network that played the game on a level Dr. Thomas hadn't even begun to understand. And now, the stakes were higher than ever. As the plane taxied to the gate, Dr. Thomas realized the true meaning of the woman's warning. He had unwittingly stepped into a battle for control. A battle where the lines between right and wrong, power and helplessness, were blurred beyond recognition. And as the door opened and passengers began to disembark, Dr. Thomas knew that this was far from over. In fact, it was only just beginning. The final twist came when the flight attendant, before walking off, handed Dr. Thomas an envelope with no return address. He stared at it for a moment, feeling the weight of it in his hands. The CEO, too, was now watching him, but with a strange, resigned look in his eyes. As Dr. Thomas opened the envelope, he found a single card inside with a name and a phone number scrawled in bold letters. Asterisk. If you want answers, call this number. Dr. Thomas felt his heart skip a beat. The game had just begun. Dr. Thomas sat there for a moment, staring at the card in his hands, the weight of the envelope still pressing on him. The numbers on the card seemed to glow, almost as if they were daring him to call. He felt a surge of hesitation. What had he just stepped into? Was this a chance to expose everything that had happened, or was it a trap, a way to pull him deeper into a game he didn't understand? The CEO, who had been watching him intently, shifted in his seat, breaking the silence. "You really don't know what you've just done, do you?" His voice was strained, raw. The arrogance had faded from his tone, replaced by something almost desperate. Dr. Thomas looked up, meeting the CEO's eyes for the first time since their confrontation. "No," he said, his voice steady. "I don't think I do. But I plan to find out." The CEO leaned back in his seat, his face clouded with frustration. "You think you're the first person to stand up to me? Or to think they can change anything?" He shook his head, his voice growing softer. "The people who control everything, they're untouchable. This isn't just about me. It's about a system that's been in place for decades. And you've just made yourself a target." Dr. Thomas felt a pang of unease. The woman's cryptic warning echoed in his mind. "You have no idea how deep this goes." Was it too late to back out? Or had he already crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed? The plane finally came to a stop at the gate, and the passengers began to file out, the tension of the moment slowly fading. But Dr. Thomas didn't move. His eyes stayed locked on the CEO, who seemed increasingly uncomfortable, his eyes darting around, as if he was waiting for something, or someone. The flight attendant, who had been so quiet all this time, was now standing near the exit, watching the exchange with a calm but calculating expression. Dr. Thomas noticed him glance at the CEO and then at the woman who had warned him earlier. She, too, had stood up and was now making her way toward the exit with a purposeful stride, as if this whole situation had been nothing more than a passing inconvenience. Before Dr. Thomas could move, the flight attendant approached him and spoke in a low, urgent voice. "You're going to want to make that call," he said. "Trust me." Dr. Thomas hesitated for a moment but then nodded. He stood, pocketing the card, and made his way toward the exit, the weight of the decision sitting heavily on his shoulders. He didn't know what he was walking into, but he knew one thing for sure. He couldn't walk away now. The airport terminal was bustling with activity, the noise and movement almost overwhelming after the quiet tension of the flight. As Dr. Thomas made his way toward a quieter corner, he pulled out his phone, his fingers trembling slightly as he dialed the number on the card. The phone rang twice before a voice answered. "Dr. Thomas," the voice said, cool and unbothered. "I've been expecting your call." Dr. Thomas took a deep breath. "Who is this? And what is going on? What's the truth about everything that's happened today?" The voice on the other end chuckled softly. "You have no idea, do you? You've only scratched the surface." "I need answers," Dr. Thomas pressed, his tone firm. Why did the CEO react the way he did? And who are you people? The voice sighed, as though weighing his words carefully. Let's just say you've unwittingly become part of a much bigger story. The CEO? He's not the one in control. He's just a puppet. But you, the voice paused, and Dr. Thomas felt a chill run down his spine. You've just become a player in a game of power, influence, and control. A game that's been going on for longer than you can imagine. Dr. Thomas felt his heart race. He had known there was more to this than just a racist outburst on a plane. But this was a whole new level. He wanted to ask more questions, to demand answers, but the voice spoke again, cutting him off. Meet me tomorrow, 2 p.m., at the cafe on 5th Street. I'll explain everything, but understand this. Once you come, there's no going back. You're in it now. Before Dr. Thomas could respond, the line went dead. He stared at the phone in his hand, the silence of the terminal feeling suffocating. He had been warned, more than once, that this was bigger than he realized. But what did it all mean? And who were these people? He knew that his life would never be the same. Everything had changed in that moment. The small act of standing up to the CEO had triggered something much larger than he had anticipated. And now, he was tangled in a web of influence and power, with no clear way out. The next day, Dr. Thomas found himself standing in front of the cafe on 5th Street, his heart pounding in his chest. The place was quiet, almost too quiet for such a busy part of the city. As he stepped inside, he was immediately aware of the eyes that followed him. There was something off about this place, something unsettling. He spotted the woman from the plane sitting in a corner booth, her eyes fixed on him as he approached. The same cold, calculating look in her eyes. She gestured for him to sit, and without a word, he did. The silence between them was thick, as if they were both waiting for the right moment to speak. Finally, she broke it. You should have never gotten involved, she said, her voice low and measured. But now that you have, you're going to have to make a choice. Dr. Thomas leaned forward. What choice? The woman's gaze never wavered. You can walk away now. Pretend none of this ever happened. Or, you can stay and learn the truth. But know this. The truth isn't something you can ever undo. Once you see it, you can't unsee it. Dr. Thomas swallowed hard, the weight of the decision pressing on him. He had come this far. He couldn't back out now. I'm in, he said, his voice steady. The woman's lips curled into a small, almost imperceptible smile. Good. You'll find out soon enough. But be careful. This isn't a game you can win. It's a game you survive. With that, she slid a folder across the table, its contents a mystery that would soon unravel. And as Dr. Thomas opened it, his eyes widening at the shocking truths within, he realized just how deep this rabbit hole went. But there was no turning back now. He was a part of something much larger than he had ever imagined. And the game? It had only just begun.